Are you overweight, and have you always been overweight? Can you remember that even as a child your weight was an issue? Well, today's video, what I was going to talk about was why it's not your fault, and here are some of the reasons why it's not your fault. So hi there, I'm Vanessa McLennan, and I'm a clinical hypnotherapist, psychotherapist, and I help people with their binge eating and overeating by working on the inner then so that they can have a life free from food stress. So if you like what you see on this channel, please click on the subscribe button and click on the bell. There are so many factors that come into this, into how we are brought up, and especially, our relationship with food, how that plays that part. There's nature, nurture is a very good question. We as children are at the mercy of our caregivers, given is that our parents or are there other people involved, and quite often there are so many people involved in our upbringing, from wider family members to teachers, to people that are prominent in communities, or just an infrastructure that we have as a child. But none of that has been decided by us. That's all been decided by our primary caregivers, our parents, a lot of the time. And so we are so, at the mercy of the way that they've been brought up, what they believe, what they want in the world, and what they want for us as children. And sometimes, that can be very, very positive, but sometimes we can get from that really sort of implied or explicit messages that are detrimental to us, and especially about food. And sometimes we take on our parents' unhealthy relationships with food, or something that relates to food, and then that becomes a part of us. Or sometimes they're just other behaviours that are very, very detrimental to us, that we unfortunately sometimes just have no control over, but it comes out in our relationship with food. So I've picked 5 top reasons that I see that our parents have a big influence with us over food. Trauma. This is quite a biggie, and you may have experienced trauma either on a major basis or on a mild basis. And it could be at home you grew up with some sort of mild trauma. Now you might think of trauma as, you might be like, oh, it's not that bad. But trauma, mild trauma, could be something that is, very, very uncomfortable for you, just causes you that upset. And it might not just happen once, but it might be happening day after day after day. A major trauma then is going to have a big part in this as well, in that your brain is responding then to that trauma. You are constantly in that fight or flight situation. You are constantly feeling stressed. You are constantly feeling on shaky ground as a child. Nothing is secure, nothing is safe. There's maybe a lack of love, or a lack of care, lack of empathy, lack of guidance there, from your caregivers. And as a child, it's putting you in some very dangerous or horrible situations that as a child you just don't know how to process those emotions. We don't sometimes even know how to process them as an adult, let alone as a child. And again, a lot of it is just outside of your control, and our bodies need a way of managing all of that. And what we do is sometimes we make that unconscious decision to turn to food, because food might give us that comfort, might give us that security, might give us this safety net that we are so craving, that we are not getting from elsewhere, and also that we're not able to process our emotions. So food just helps us in some way to calm, or to just be, or that we don't even have to think about the trauma, and it just takes over and lets us be who we are. Emotional abuse. If throughout your life you have been at the end of constant criticism, put downs, being told you're not good enough, what you do is not good enough, being shouted at constantly, always doing something wrong, we're going to grow up with a really poor view of ourselves. We're going to take that in somehow, and especially as children we do take that in. We believe it all to be true, and so growing up that way then it's just, we're going to grow up with a sense of low self-esteem, with lacks of beliefs in ourselves. We're not going to be able to feel as confident perhaps as we could do. And what this leads to then is us not liking ourselves as much as we could do, and hence then also not perhaps liking our bodies, because our bodies are going to be part of ourselves. Or we're not going to not dislike ourselves, but we're not going to think of ourselves as positive, amazing creatures. We might have that poor view of ourselves, and with that we're going to then not care so much about ourselves, and that's going to come in with our food. We're not going to care so much about what food we put in, what food we eat, when we eat. That relationship with food is going to mirror how we feel about ourselves. So we're not going to put as much effort or care looking after ourselves with our food as we could do. And of course then, the more that we eat, the more that gives us this downward spiral, because the more we eat, the bigger we get, the more that we dislike ourselves. The more that we dislike ourselves, we funnily enough start turning to food to feel better about ourselves. But of course that puts us back into that downward cycle, which is then hard to sometimes get out of, but it is doable, it's just harder. Sexual abuse. If you have been through sexual abuse, you will know just how traumatic it can be, and also what can be equally or as traumatic is you do get the courage to tell somebody and then you are not believed about it. Often with sexual abuse comes emotional abuse, comes threats. If you tell somebody, then I'll do this to you. And can you imagine, like, as an adult, this would be very, very distressing. So as a child, it's even more distressing, because you don't know what's going on. You just know how horrible it all is, and it also becomes very, very confusing, because a lot of the time, is it being done by somebody who supposedly is supposed to love you or has loved you, and now they're coming in to hurt you. So it's very, disorientating. And because you don't know then how to process, your emotions, you don't know what's happening, you're often put as a threat that, the person doing this to you, they will be believed. So if you go and tell somebody, will you be in trouble? Will you not be believed? So it's then also, how do you go and tell somebody? Because maybe you can't, process it or communicate it to tell somebody to help yourself. So it just keeps you at the mercy of your abuser, which is very, very traumatizing. So food comes in here, and I think also perhaps while we might be going through that, or as a response to that, because food can help us disassociate from those feelings. Food is a way of moving out of our feelings into some sort of level of comfort. We might also learn that when we get bigger, we might be left alone. We don't get so much attention. So food can also just be that escape route that we need to be able to not feel these horrible feelings anymore. But food is the answer and that comfort net when nothing else might be. Dieting parents. When you were growing up, were your parents, constantly dieting, for instance? Were they giving you the messages, like they might have been telling you that, moaning about their own weight, not being happy with themselves around food, telling you that, I can't eat this, honey, I'm on a diet this week. No, we're not having that because I'm on a diet. So the messages you're receiving are constantly, oh, this is what we do, we go on diets, and also, oh, mum or dad are not enough as they are, they need to go on a diet. And maybe they had very poor eating habits themselves, or disordered eating themselves, and maybe they were binge eaters or overeaters, comfort eaters. Maybe there was a lot of processed, rubbish food around the house, loads of biscuits, loads of crisps. And maybe, it was a free-for-all. Maybe they didn't have any guidelines or boundaries around food. And being a young child, of course you're going to love to eat, the biscuits and the crisps the whole time, because it was always there, and your parents didn't say no. Your parents didn't teach you what was healthy or not healthy. So you just ate it. So maybe then a lot of implied messages get put in here, and so that you could then end up following on that same cycle, or also being taught how to be with how your parents are around food. Food as a weapon. when you were younger, was food used as a way to discipline you, to keep you in line? If you didn't behave, were you not fed? Was it conditional, on something, that you had to be something and then you got rewarded with, crisps or biscuits or sweets, for instance? Was food taken away from you? Were you not allowed to eat certain things? If you went into cupboards, and got like biscuits or snacks, were you really told off, scolded, humiliated also? I see this quite a lot, that a lot of us are taught to eat everything off our plate, especially if you have parents that were in, the war generation, where food was really, really scarce. And so, of course, I suppose for them, any bit of food was, oh my god, good food, because they managed to get hold of it, and they probably didn't want to see their children wasting it. But then the messages that has come through today is that you have to clear everything off your plate. And in schools, for instance, if you didn't eat anything, were you humiliated? Like, did you have to stay behind, for instance, or eat in front of the class, or eat something that you really didn't like, because that was the hard and steady rules? And maybe your parents had very, rigid rules around food and around what is allowed and what isn't allowed. But all of that then gets instilled in us, and it creates, really sort of like rigid rules for us, or it creates very uncomfortable feelings for us. And also what that does is it cuts off our own natural instincts around food, because maybe we want to eat something, maybe naturally we want to go for certain foods, but the conditioning that we received as children stops us from doing that. So that just creates that feeling of unease within us, and then that comes out obviously in an unease in our relationship with food.